The man who lives in this house says all of us should have as much neurosis as we can stand. The man who lives here can't tell you anything about getting ahead. All he can do is illuminate life. That's one of his friends going into the house, a former student of his. Here's the man we're talking about, James Hearst. Although he has published 4 books, Mr. Hearst says a book is only a kind of record. Life is rooted in the earth. As a young man, James Hearst was permanently injured by a diving accident in the Cedar River, and now much of the time he's confined to a wheelchair. That is to say, his body is confined. Mr. Hearst is a teacher in the Department of Languages, Speech, and Literature at the State College of Iowa in Cedar Falls. He's also a philosopher, the manager of a 200-acre farm, and a poet. To share a meal with Mr. and Mrs. Hearst is an invigorating experience. Not only is the conversation lively and agreeable, but you quickly find yourself shedding those conventions of speech and manner that all of us acquire in our youth to keep from enjoying each other. It's easy to get acquainted with James Hearst because he makes it easy. And to get acquainted is to discover again that warm felicity that permeates every encounter with a truly generous spirit. There he is on your TV screen, James Hearst, poet. And maybe you're wondering, what is a poet for? We think his quiet eloquence will answer that question for you.
This is Channel 2's continuing series, Eye on Iowa. Up to now, our eye has been focused on the public affairs of the state, on taxes, on government, on schools, on other institutions. Tonight's program, however, is concerned with the insights offered by a single perceptive mind, the mind of James Hearst. Mr. Hearst has recently published his 4th volume of poetry. He appears on our broadcast tonight through the cooperation of the State College of Iowa in Cedar Falls, where he teaches creative writing. It's our privilege, then, to share with you the mind of James Hearst, a mind that's been active in Iowa for something like 60 years. And to act as our host for this half hour, we're pleased to welcome again George Gunkel from the State University in Iowa City. George Gunkel, you'll recall, was the host for Channel 2's special Christmas broadcast, and we're happy to have him back.
Every presentation requires some setting, some explanation. So why are we presenting James Hearst? Well, we live in a world where most of us spend a great deal of time contemplating business of one sort or another. For that reason, we thought it'd be refreshing to present a man whose business is contemplating. And what does James Hearst contemplate? Well, much of the time he contemplates the values he acquired from that old, wise, and venerable institution, the earth. Let me quote him. The actual objective creation that man achieves, he achieves with seed and ground. One eye, of course, always on the weather. The fruit of this union is so beautiful, so concrete, and so satisfying that the personal arts expressed in picture, song, and book seem faint by comparison. A book is only a kind of record. Life is rooted in the earth. This affinity for the earth is a viewpoint that James Hearst shares with his personal friends, Carl Sandburg and Robert Frost. He seems to believe, as they do, that the earth defies management, that in fact it manages us. The first poem he will read for us is an ironic statement of this philosophy. It's called Success. Succeeding poems in this first group will also deal with man's relationship to the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, James Hearst.
When I come home from work at close of day, blind with the sunset, faced with the evening chores, The hungry pigs, the unmilked cows, the hens, restless for my attention, with feed and hay to measure and lift, it seems the whole outdoors would let its need for order rest on me. I hear the windmill's voice as I clean pens, but never the meadowlark's, a warning sign I've meant to heed someday, but never do. Now I am old and stooped, I've come to see that each year charges interest for its use, that life's a mortgage no one can renew. I found I traded even, farm for sweat, to justify the boast I'm master yet. Shaky and cold under the wind's abuse, I read on the tax receipts, the land is mine. The next is called His Daily Pack. Come here and let me tell you about this man who always crossed his T's and dotted his I's in what he said or thought or tried to do, convinced his addiction to order was enterprise. He carefully drew to scale each map he planned to account for a world that ran on a wobbly wheel. The roads he surveyed all lay straight and true. His facts were obedient, taught like a dog to heel. But the grain he harvested always invited rats, and his purebred heifer wasted from scours when he doctored her feed. He promised his wife to attend her funeral at 9:30, and the clock struck 10. One day a spark from the trash pile leveled his barn. "I'm through with farming," he yelled. He never came back. It's sad when you stop to think how the rules he made kept breaking like straps when he shouldered his daily pack. I never wonder a lot about stars. I'm much too busy with things of this earth that show when a season of labor is done just what the labor's been worth. Stars are all right to admire like flowers. I like to see pretty things when I'm done working in fields. But what do I care whether a star is a stone? There's plenty to learn in the ways of a seed. What do you get if you study the sky? I'm greater for holding one fruit in my hand than a heaven of stars in my eye.
That last poem was called The Reason for Stars. Now, with Mr. Hearst's permission, I'd like to read 3 poems of his, one about a sow, one about a robin, and one about the abstract concept of truth. We'll begin with the one about the sow. Ho there, you crazy sow, where do you think you're going? Charging through the garden like the devil's on your tail. Did I forget to lock the gate, or did you force the latches? Someday I'll skin you for your hide and hang it on a nail. Hey, quit dodging back there, sniffing the air for mischief. Turn around, behave yourself, get back into your pen. Don't stop to smell the daffodils or cultivate the roses. You've rooted up the pansy bed to prove you're loose again. Let me catch my breath now before you test me further. Easy, easy. That's a girl. Walk right through that gate. Let me offer you a hand so we won't take all morning, as if I'd nothing else to do but pass the time and wait. At times, I see in you, old sow, ways like mine too clearly. You won't jump to attention when someone blows his horn as if he ran the township. Don't chomp your jaws at me. The Lord had trouble with nature the day when you were born. Look, it's almost 12 o'clock. Quit your crazy fooling. Move, or take what's coming. I'm ready to throw the switch. Come on, you've raised enough hell. Let's have peace and order. Come on. This is my last word, you big, black, slippery bitch. I hope we didn't offend any sows with that last poem. Sometimes, you know, they tune in to catch the feed commercials. This next poem is called Robin in the Straw. A robin scratches right and left about the straw-embroidered hem of beds where flowers burst their shells. But he is not in search of them. He kicks out gaily with his legs. He thrusts in wildly with his beak. I wish I might encourage him, but he would fly if I could speak. I stop my day to watch him work. He pulls and winks his head about and spreads his wings and stamps his feet when worm resists his coming out. When I go plowing in the field with hat and coat hung on a limb and sweat to hold my plow and team, I wonder how I look to him. That was from a book called Country Men by James Hearst. Mr. Hearst likes to say that it's a poet's business to draw analogies. And I think he draws a good one in the poem that he calls Truth. How the devil do I know if there are rocks in your field? Plow it and find out. If the plow strikes something harder than earth, the point shatters at a sudden blow, and the tractor jerks sidewise and dumps you off the seat because the spring hitch isn't set to trip quickly enough. And it never is. Probably you hit a rock. That means the glacier emptied his pocket in your field as well as mine. But the connection with a thing is the only truth that I know of. So, plow it. Well, now, let's segue from poetry to movies for a few minutes and show you some of the real estate that prompted the lines we've been reciting. On one of the coldest days of the year, we took movies at the family farm where James Hearst was born. That's Mr. Hearst driving towards us. He was born in the house on the right. Here's some of his land, and as he might describe it, empty of all save weather. He pointed out his barn and silo. The familiar profile of rural Iowa. And from the warmth of the car, we watched his cattle shambling by, white-faced Herefords with built-in insulation. Two of the girls were a bit skittish. A final glance at the house, and then back to town. And that was a quick tour of some of the external features that conditioned the life of James Hearst. But we all know that a poet's life is also conditioned by the world inside him. So here's Bruce Anderson to ask Mr. Hearst a few questions about ideas and concepts.
We might as well start off with an impossible question, Mr. Hearst. Why are we here? Or as the Catechism might say, what's the chief end of man?
This is a problem, I think, that's concerned more intelligent people than I am, and from many years back, the Greeks wrestled with this question. I'm sure the Egyptians did too, and the Babylonians. The Hebrews took it very seriously. We're here, I suppose, because we are born into a world that's not of our own making, and when we get here, we try to make some kind of meaning out of it. We find purpose for ourselves. I think each one of us, in a way, takes a point of view of the world, I call it the ground he stands on, and tries to find meaning in the world that will satisfy him. We have to count for something in the world. We're here to count for something. I think that the necessity for being an important part of the of the world's civilization or culture is a necessity for all of us. In other words, we need to be needed. We have to have some kind of reason for our existence, even if we have to make it up. I sometimes think this is true about people who wonder if they are religious or not. They have to have a faith that they have faith. And perhaps this is the only thing that's given to them. Certainly you can't apply the methods of science to theology. I would no more think of trying to prove the existence of God or the reason why I'm here by scientific methods than I'd think of trying to grow a third leg. It seems to me that the logical positivists and the linguistic philosophers and some of the other refugees from traditional metaphysics begin to sound a little stale and old-fashioned these days. I think there is more reawakening in people of this feeling that science is very well as a process for manipulating the external world in which we live, but it will no longer serve as a method for bringing them into some kind of harmony with the world in which they live. And the world in which we live being the fearful place it is these days, we have perhaps not fallen back on a traditional Christian belief, but we certainly, there's a reawakening among people in a need to believe in something outside themselves, and this something may be a perfectly humanist philosophy, but at least we've discovered that we can no longer afford to be our brother's murderers.
Bertrand Russell maintains that people are psychologically attuned to the rhythms of the earth, and when they get too far away from these rhythms, society sickens or languishes. Would you go along with that?
I think so. I think we all have to have some kind of contact with the world in which we live. I don't think you can get on a springboard or some kind of elevation that takes you away from the world or away from people or things. Things are important too in this world, and in order to do this, well, it's sort of a fancy talk to talk about the rhythms of the world. I know some of the Tibetan priests have stones that you can hold in your hand and feel the rhythms of the earth and find out whether you're in tune with them or not. This isn't what I mean exactly. I think you have to feel some kind of contact with the ground on which you stand, whether it's pavement or whether it's a field or whether it's a floor in an office building. Somehow you've got to feel that you are a part of this organization that we call the universe, and that you can sense your loyalties to it and your identification with it. You know, Frost said one time, I was joking about, still being a tough man and this individuality of his, resisting any kind of encroachment of socialism or government. And he said, well, I get my strength, the old New England granite comes right through the bottoms of my feet. And, well, this is what I mean. I think we have to have some of the old granite, whatever it is, wherever we find it, come right through the bottoms of our feet to sustain us.
You spoke of Frost, and I recollect that he once defined a poem as a feat of association. And this brings us into the nebulous area of defining poems. Do you have a definition?
I like better his definition of a poem as beginning in delight and ending in wisdom. But for useful purposes, I mean, there are many definitions of poems. Wallace Stevens has 24 ways of looking at a blackbird, which is nothing but a bunch of definitions of poetry. And well, all poets have tried it. But a useful definition of poetry is one that the Frenchman, Paul Valéry, uses when he said, a poem is an expression of the inner landscape in terms of the outer. Or Marianne Moore said, a poem is an imaginary garden with a real toad in it. Well,
I like it.
She really means something there. People from cavemen lives on to the present time have been moved by many of the same experiences. I mean emotional experiences. Let's take the big ones: birth, life, death, love, hate, revenge. But they've always been enacted or acted out or happened to you. The happenings have always been in different circumstances, from generation to generation, from person to person. Like snowflakes, we're all human beings, but we're all different too in our way. And so this is the imaginary garden of Marion Moore's definition, the place and the time where these things happen. The poet can imagine these things, but the real toad that's in the garden, this is the truth of the experience that is immemorial, that is universal. The truth of love or the truth of death or the truth of birth doesn't change. And this is the real toad that you find in the garden, which the poet has made in a different milieu or circumstance or situation for each time.
Modern poetry is sometimes criticized for being esoteric and too subjective. Do you feel that a poet has to communicate?
Well, I'm afraid I belong to that school that thinks if the poem is going to be worth anything, it ought to be read. It should be both read and enjoyed, and it should communicate something too. But I have sympathy with the young poet who says to himself, gee, these things have all been said before by other people and better than I've said them. How am I going to find my originality? How will people know that I have an imagination too? So he tries to find a new way of saying things. And this is what puts him into this spot that you're talking about. He begins to use private symbols. And nobody knows what they mean but he knows. Of course, Robert Browning said only God and Robert Browning know what this poem means, and now only God knows. Well, the young poet's a little bit in this situation. How am I going to say it new? The theme is old. What am I going to do about it? This is where he gets into the bind, where he begins to, become obscure because he's using new ways of saying things. And he hasn't quite gelled yet or crystallized his method. So he gets into an obscure way of saying things.
Well, you have sympathy for the beginning poet, let's call him, but you feel that he strives toward communicating. Does he have to communicate for his own time? Might he communicate for another time?
Oh, this is true. This is true. He does. He may be a man way ahead of his audience, and I think this has happened over and over again. All you have to do is read the criticism of the past to realize it. Let's take an example. When I read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, I just worked like a Trojan trying to figure out what his meanings were. And I read the reference books, Jesse L. Weston's from Romance, Ritual Through Romance, and Sanskrit, the Buddhist Fire Sermon, all this stuff, tracing down these references, because I was going to have to teach it. And if you have to teach it, you're supposed to know something about it. At least the students think you should. But my students don't work this hard on it. They are born into the climate or the atmosphere or the cultural air that T.S. Eliot was talking about. They've come along. They're another generation than I am, and it comes to them much easier. I think this is true of much poetry. It's hard to read when you first see it, but give it a few years or maybe a generation.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Hearst, all of them wise and meaningful. It seems to me that it might be fitting at this point if you were to read for us your poem called Movement Toward Certainty. Would you do that?
I'll be glad to. The afternoon closed in until it seemed no larger than a room of snow and cloud. The small March sun glowed dimly in its socket. The window of the air looked out on mist. I met you there among the apple trees, close to the feedlot where the playful steers rumpled the bedding in their narrow pen. And starlings searched the ground for spilled out grain like careful businessmen. The fog was a wall. Oh, we were all prisoners of the day, though some found fences more substantial than the feeling. I was centered in my mood. Your warm appraising look slid off my back like quicksand. Underneath our boots the snow shifted, and we sank deeper in our coats. Look, and you pointed to a maple tree, where swollen buds now showed a waxy red. I looked from where the bare ground defied the frayed snow carpet, and you said, "There's not much yet." I felt the wind, not freezing, raw and wet. A ghostly crow in the fog spoke his short piece with nothing new to say. I looked at you and saw your hair curl lively from your scarf, framing your face where the excitement grew out of an anxious frown, as if the light had come to light blind eyes. Your mittened hand turned snug in mine like a child's, while a shadow went away from your face. and the actual bodies of things filled up the space where their shadows had seemed to be. Nothing seemed changed, and yet the change was there, in the tree, in the bird, in you, and I felt your love beat in me like a pulse I had always known.
I feel sure that James Hearst has a vision much wider than anybody's creed. But he did put something on paper once that would seem to express his hard-bitten, plain-spoken, wonderful philosophy. He called it need of solid ground. He hadn't offended God, nor failed his word the way he worked, for there were only a few who could match his efforts. He felt that so much sweat deserved return, a soaking rain, not dew. He looked at the fields the frost had spit upon. How much was a man called on these days to bear? The black and wilted vines, the withered stalks. He doubled up his fist and pummeled the air, lamenting, then growled indifference to the threat of ruined crops and shouldered his hurt aside. Let God pile it on. He would make no more complaint, but laugh at the spear defeat thrust in his side. He needed some solid ground on which to stand, or a text to sustain him. But nothing he knew seemed pat. He thought, most men get along as best they can. Well, it's something, I guess, just to stand on that.
Well, I think it's important that each one of us feels that we count for something in this world. I'm not sure I know why we're here, but I know that after we are here, we like to feel that we make some sort of impact on the world, even if it's just a little impact. We don't want to feel that all our trouble and our sweat and agony, pain, struggle has been for nothing. And so we make for ourselves